A lot of people in the 20th century have tried to pathologize Hitler, to try figure out what was going on inside of his mind and come up with some type of label to describe the state of his mental faculties. Some psychologists have proposed that Hitler was autistic, others have said that he was a homosexual, others still have said that he was suffering from an Oedipal complex and had a Freudian repression of his trauma that came from his father. All of these turn out to be incorrect when you inspect them at any serious level, and they reveal to us how narrow-minded modern psychology is. This attempt to slap a label on somebody's mind, which essentially deadens the vividness and richness of their personality. But of course, there is one psychologist who actually psychoanalyzed Hitler and came up with a proposition as to what was going on inside of his mind, and didn't make the mistake of telling a one-dimensional tale about the nature of his character and personality. And this psychologist was Carl Jung. Now, what makes Carl Jung's assessment of Hitler even more superior than much of the jargonites that came later in the 20th century is that Carl Jung actually met Adolf Hitler at a rally. He met Adolf Hitler at a rally alongside Mussolini. So he was able to assess these very influential men up close, and this allowed him to make a comparison between the two that very much highlights who Hitler was. In order to articulate this, Carl Jung went very primal. He went back to the fundamental archetypes of mankind. In the primal world of tribal life, there are only really two types of leaders. One is a strong man, a military superman, somebody who commands the alpha male status. This would be like a mafia don, Julius Caesar, or, as Jung pointed out, Mussolini. But Jung says the other archetype that gains enormous power in the primal soul of man is the shaman. This is the mythical man who can control the realm of symbols and essentially bewitch or inspire the people around him to do what he wants them to do. This would be a pharaoh, a high priest like the Pope who controls the symbols of Christendom and commands holy crusades. This would be Adolf Hitler. Now, this is so important because many of the traits that inspire these low-resolution diagnoses of Hitler actually serve into this idea of Hitler being a shaman. Hitler was known to many people around him to be quite dreamy. He had this enormous, vivid imagination. He was, of course, an artist when he was younger. Some people who knew him from his childhood believed that he was going to grow up to become an artist. Hitler himself discussed how he told his dad that he loved art, and his dad was like, "What are you going to be, one of them faggots? You're not gonna make any art, my friend. You're gonna go become a government bureaucrat, a civil servant, and you're gonna do a responsible job in the state filling out Excel sheets." But Hitler didn't want that. Now, on top of this strong imagination and this love for the world of ideas, Hitler was known to describe what he sees in his mind through long, monologue-like rants. And sometimes he could be quite ferocious. If somebody came in with some stupid nonsense that didn't keep up with his genius brain, he'd get a little bit upset. He'd start to go at them. He'd start to say to them, "You're really not a really sharp one, are you? You're kind of a dummy. I don't think you should be talking in my presence." Now, many people would look at this and say, that kind of sounds autistic. That sounds a little bit like autism. And many of the midwit psychologists I can empathize with, when they read stories like this, they will try to throw this categorization on this. And then on top of all this, he seemed to live his life quite celibate. When he had the ultimate power in the German nation, he didn't use it the way that you would expect most men to. All the women in Germany used to throw themselves at Hitler. They absolutely adored him. An American woman came over during the Olympics and tried to kiss him, and they had to push him off. Now, perhaps he was trying to hold up an image, but it does seem that he tended to be quite distant. He was with Eva Braun, for example, and he never married her. Whereas you see the likes of Mussolini and Stalin even, and Goebbels around Hitler, and they were men of high status, and they really made use of it. They had very normal and abundant sexual lives. And Jung astutely saw this and realized that this is not the sign necessarily of a pathology, but it's the sign of a man that is living the life which you would say is a priestly life. Like any Catholic priest or monk who denies the world in order to live a more pure and godly life. An idealistic man who's wrapped up in the world of ideas. This is like a mystic or a sage or a shaman. So on the one hand, you have someone like Stalin or Mussolini enforcing their status in the state as the highest authority because they are the strongest, the meanest, the most violent, the most lion-like, the most savage. And so when people would ask themselves, why should Mussolini be my leader? The answer is quite simple. He is the baddest man out there. He's fighting in my corner. He's the strongest man and he leads because he's the most dangerous. Whereas Hitler gets his authority in a much different way. He did not spend his time flexing and showing off that he was the supreme bodybuilder to the people of Germany. Instead, he would call out of them their imagination. He would lift out of them their hopes. He would articulate visions and ideals in their mind. He was literate and educated. He would almost come across as sort of introverted, like the misunderstood, outcast, artistic genius. But when he would step forward, people would recognize that this guy is seeing things in the astral plane and pulling them down and offering them to us and promising that he'll make them happen. This guy is not a tough guy. This guy is a dreamer. And this is why Jung believed that Hitler developed around him a following that was much more intense and even religious than Mussolini. This is why Hitler was able to generate this category of the Führer, the leader, the mystical man that was carrying people forward into the future. He was a high priest leading the soul of the nation, and people would project on him a religious hope. People saw him literally as a god. And this is where we might actually get one of Jung's first diagnoses, that he thinks that Hitler lost his individuality to the German nation, that at some point Hitler chose to give up his own ego, his own rights to his own destiny, and instead said, I will be a vessel to carry the German nation forward. I'm going to let the German nation's collective will channel through me. Now, in fairness, that's a lot more fun than saying he has autism. So here's Jung's quote on Nietzsche. So an interesting question is, how did Hitler become a vessel that could be possessed by a nation like this? How did he become this sort of detached, maybe a little bit scornful of the world man, ready to receive such idealistic and profound spiritual realities? Well, first of all, this was his character. He had a disposition towards this. Many people described him as a bit aloof and dreamy when he was younger. He famously did try to go to art school. Even when he became chancellor of the entire German nation, he spent an awful lot of time creating this large sort of city that was his vision of the city to build. So he was a sort of idealistic, dreaming man. But then when he goes through Weimar Germany, after Germany loses World War I, he comes in contact with a degraded and disgusting Germany. This is a Germany he walks through where he comes across prostitution. Everybody is trapped in debt slavery. They are humiliated. Everybody is poor. He's seeing German people go onto the streets and sell their... He's seen German men give up on Germany and start to shoot themselves, give up on their women. And this is something that would have made him very off with the world. He would have seen this world around him and felt disgusted by it, made himself feel sick. Perhaps his response to this was like what a priest would experience when they come in contact with the fallen world. You can imagine this all throughout history, monks going and seeing life as it is, like the Buddha, or like a priest, or like a Christian mystic, and saying, this life is awful, this life is evil and degrading and disgusting and animalistic, it is fallen, and I want to detach, I want to escape from it. And this is what leads to the priestly life, to choose celibacy, to choose rejection, to choose scorn of the world itself. I don't want to be a part of this fallen world. And Hitler was known to have enormous feelings of disgust. He often articulated them. He wanted everything to be cleaner. Why this dirty degradation? Why does Germany have to turn into this filth that it has turned into? Now, a fascinating angle to this is that Hitler loved Schopenhauer, and he read Schopenhauer while he was in the World War I trenches. And Schopenhauer was an infamous, massive pessimist who encouraged all of these attitudes: disgust for this world, hate this world as evil, as this noxious, fuming, rotten place that tries to drag you into its disgusting will. This feeling of ugliness permeating all of life. This idea that what you need to do in order to engage with this life is to actually reject it, to look at this life as being beneath you, and for you to take this moral attitude that you want to impose something more beautiful upon this life, and that's just about the only good thing you can do. In fact, sexuality itself is evil. The idea of you creating a child or engaging in this world sexually to create a future is an evil act, because this world is evil, and you getting caught up in the illusions of women and seduction and desire is all a signal of your weakness, your willingness to engage in this cruel, disgusting, fallen world. And so the only moral thing for you to do is to try create some grand piece of art, to take all that sexual will that you have and spend it almost like a fireworks show. Instead of just using the gunpowder, you blow it off in some type of beautiful moment and create like a Wagnerian opera, or do something incredible like reform the entire political nation towards a new idealistic society. That's the only way you should spend your life. Now, that's a much more sophisticated idea of why Hitler may have been a celibate. He was stern. He was looking to reform the world, which he saw as disgusting and below him. He was putting Schopenhauer into practice. There's plenty of good evidence for this. For example, Hitler loved animals. He was an innovator in animal welfare. Do not tell the vegans, or they'll all start buying Hugo Boss suits or something like this. And of course, animal welfare is an attitude that Schopenhauer encourages. Interestingly, Hitler has been quoted as saying he never found much use in Nietzsche, who was seen largely as Schopenhauer's refutation, as the side of Schopenhauer that says this world is not to be disregarded and considered disgusting, but instead embraced. And interestingly, the more worldly strongman Caesar-like Mussolini loved Nietzsche, to the point that when Hitler visited Mussolini, he brought down an entire volume of Nietzsche's work, a special gift from Germany. It seems like Hitler did not so fundamentally engage with Nietzsche, although he did like him. Now, it becomes clear once you understand this that this character profile is almost like a dark, romantic idealist. Someone who's willing to literally destroy the world in order to bring his vision in reality. Now, of course, it's quite easy to say that this is probably very antisocial. This is a signal of misanthropic feelings. Of course, this type of character becoming the head of a nation would lead to a war, and that's all true. But you also have to consider that if he didn't have these character traits, if he didn't have this sternness, this severity, this extremeness inside of his soul, would he really have been able to rise up the ranks as a completely unknown bumpkin from Austria and take over one of the largest nations in the world? This is something that people really struggle with an awful lot. Everybody would like everybody to be perfect all the time, but the reality of life is that you can actually be littered with vices or biases or problems, but they can work to your advantage at times. To drop a quote, Nietzsche says that careful banishing out your demons because you may be ridding yourself of the best in you. But since we have brought up demons, we may as well get on to our next very unsettling question. Jung did suggest that Hitler, in his disgust for the world, his idealism, his romantic and dark hope for transforming the world, may have given his soul over to a force greater than himself and become possessed by it. Jung's suggestion was that the entire German people got caught up in essentially an unconscious process, meaning there was nobody actually in control. Hitler himself had decided to give himself over to the collective will of the Germans, and because of this, it was almost like a giant forceful instinct that was driving the whole situation. Now, Jung says that this collective will that was driving the situation was actually the German god Wodan. Now, you might think, is this some god that lives up in the sky? But Jung's idea of a god is a little bit different. He is looking at it as the united force of all the Germans, people's souls, collecting together and acting as a giant unit, like a tribal force, with no central control. It almost has like a will of its own that's carrying the tribe along, without any single person of the tribe being able to steer it. This is what Jung describes as the Wodan force. And Jung's assertion is that Hitler was possessed by Wodan. He was almost like a mystic man, a yogi sage who learned to shut off his ego, the thing that everybody so cultivates in the hippie movement. But the problem is that it was not his true self that revealed. It wasn't his Buddha mind that showed up. The thing that took the place of his ego as the authority within his imagination was the spirit of the German people themselves, the god Wodan. Now, Jung's suggestions here start to get a little bit wacky, but he does so with decent enough evidence, much better evidence than I often see in most other parts of psychology. And so one of Jung's suggestions is that Wodan was living or active inside the collective imagination of the German people for a couple of generations. And Hitler was the final mannequin, the final vessel that shows up right at the end, the avatar which Wodan channeled himself into in order to achieve his final goal, which was to use the German people to create a war. Because what is Wodan's goal? Think about your German myths, my friends. Wodan's problem in the German myths is that he has been cursed with a destiny to die during Ragnarok. And he spends his time trying to figure out a way that he can change his fate, change his destiny, because he knows that a giant wolf of evil and chaos is going to kill him at the end of time. So one notion that he comes up with is that he will be able to spend his time moving around Germany, moving around the Nordic people, and starting wars. He likes to set off fights, to send people berserk, so he can get them to start fighting people, and he can watch all these battles and see who is the best warriors. When he sends them the berserk, who stands up to the occasion and proves that they're great fighters. So Wodan goes around setting off fights, starting wars, and then he sends his Valkyries to fly in and spot the people who he's decided are the best fighters, his ravens watching from the trees as Nordic Vikings kill themselves and kill their friends and kill other people in these berserk rages. And then Wodan sends in the Valkyries to pluck them up and bring these soldiers off into Valhalla, where they will await until the end of time when the great battle will come. And Wodan will have this legion of super warriors that he has harvested throughout all of time, ready to fight the wolf of chaos at the end. Now, when you know this, you start to realize, wait a second, that's not exactly a plan that's suitable for you. That's not a plan to put together a functioning nation or run a democratic society. That's not really what we expected at all. And I think Jung's implying that many of the Germans during this period made this mistake. They might have thought that this Wodanic energy that was inside of them had some sort of plan to create a kingdom of heaven, a utopia, to structure a perfectly functioning society and put together a nice, pretty civilization. That's not Wodan's goal at all. Wodan's goal is to create war and chaos so he can see heroes rise out of it. His goal is no plan to create stability. He doesn't give a crap about the people or about any of that stuff. He wants a fight. He wants death at an enormous scale so he can see who is the best of the best. Now, this obviously seems far out, and us very serious, civilized scientists would never allow ourselves to entertain such a suggestion that the Germans were possessed by the god of fury, trying to find out which among them were heroes. But when you actually look at the Eastern Front and what went down there between the Soviets and the Nazis, you begin to realize that it had all the qualities of a mythic super battle. And when you start to understand the psychology of the Germans going into that fight, you realize that there was something very strange about it. The Germans were killing Russians on a rate of 6-1 at points. They were going in with this incredibly high morale. They really were just furious and festering and down for a fight. The scope of the battle was enormous. More people died in that battle than any single event in all of human history. It's incomprehensible. There were millions of lives sent into the underworld or the overworld during this period. It's like reading the arrival of Indra in Indian myth. It was this giant, like, super army and super force taking place. And the psychology of the soldiers is actually well attested and quite strange to people. Here's a fascinating quote that I have saved on my phone. This is from a priest called Antanas who was interviewing soldiers. "First, I asked the Bolsheviks, 'What are you fighting for?' And they said, 'For the Soviet government.' I then asked the same of the Lithuanians, and they replied, 'For our religion.' But when I asked the Germans, they told me that we are fighting for the fighting itself. When we will be killed, this will be our destiny, and our aim will be achieved." I could not understand this answer, says the priest. The Germans were driven insane. They were fighting just to die. Weirdly, they were massively motivated as well. They had a berserk energy inside of themselves that made them fearless, fierce, monstrous, and incredibly dangerous. On the flip side, the Soviets had huge morale problems. Stalin was harvesting people from all across the enormous Russian Empire and sending them marching towards the Germans, and they had to bring up weapons behind them and say, "If you turn around, we will shoot you." The psychological difference between these two forces is quite enormous. Now, in Jung's essay Wodan, which he wrote before World War II, he describes the build-up of this energy and how it would lead to this situation. Because Wodan is the god of the storm, the god of wind, the god of frenzy. He is a blustering, fierce, blowing storm god that whooshes people and gets them moving. He's the god of the hunt, the god of the wandering, the god of the wilds. And what happened in Germany over time is that there was this gradual building up of this type of moving energy, this roving, roaming, wandering energy. Wodan was ultimately a wanderer in the forest, searching for a solution to his destiny. And Jung points out that one of the earliest parts of this was the arrival of the Boy Scouts. So Germany had this institution where the boys would go out into nature and try to go out into nature and like learn to live in the forests or live in the hills. And they would wander all around Europe. And it started with this, with blonde kids with their little rucksacks. And a huge part of the National Socialist movement actually stemmed out of these little institutions. Now, this wandering of the little kids, the beginning of the German nationalists, began to grow and grow and grow until the point in Weimar Germany where you see these huge hordes of roaming unemployed Germans. Almost 30%, I believe, or maybe even 40% of the German nation was unemployed during the Weimar era. And these people would wander around without a destiny, without a purpose. And of course, they would come across people like Adolf Hitler preaching in the streets, saying to them that they need to change their destiny from the degradation of the Weimar regime. And of course, it was precisely Hitler and his pronouncements that led to these wandering homeless people and these wandering Boy Scouts to suddenly all have an army that they could march with. And this is what transformed into the Nazi rallies. These enormous moments where all of Germany stood up on its feet. From little blonde boys to old blonde women. They all stood up and they marched together as one and they became a nation. And this Hitler figure became the mover, the first mover, the leader, the vessel, the avatar that was carrying them along. And there's very strange phenomenon about these Boy Scouts that later turned into the Hitler Youths. They were known to do things like sacrificing animals. They sacrificed sheep during the summer solstices and the winter solstices. So there's a sort of pagan behavior going on here. And of course, we all know that the Nazi regime was absolutely littered with pagan revival and pagan energy. Jung then says that the run-up to this was even longer than you might expect, because the Boy Scouts, the unemployed marchers, the National Socialists themselves, we all see them as a movement, a political movement that led to this massive transformation in Germany. But even before this, you were seeing characters pop up like Stefan George and of course Friedrich Nietzsche, who were providing an intellectual energy into the German psyche. Nietzsche himself is famously always talking about the need to overthrow these civilized Christian values and embrace the Dionysian god of energy. Now, Jung makes a fascinating proposition here that Nietzsche kind of bewitched himself with the seduction of the southern Mediterraneans with their croissants and espressos, and said to himself, oh, well, something that's stylish and cool, a cool new god, a sexy new brand that we can use for this god that I'm interacting with inside of my soul. We'll call it Dionysus, the god of frenzy, the god of all this down in the south. But Jung says no. Jung says Wodan actually has many of the traits that Nietzsche's Dionysus does. Of course, Wodan is also a god of frenzy. Wodan is also the god of unleashing your passions, of intoxication, of giving yourself over to chthonic forces and letting yourself get a little bit freaky. Wodan is a magician, a god of illusion and deception, a god of disguise. And Jung drives this point home by symbolically analysing Zarathustra, because anybody familiar with Zarathustra will realise that Zarathustra does tend to use quite a lot of what we might call Wodanic metaphors. And this gets quite weird because Jung is suggesting that Nietzsche was possessed by Wodan like Adolf Hitler was. Take, for example, one of Zarathustra's discourses called The Magician. Wodan was like a Gandalf-style magical figure. He's the original wizard. And in this discussion with a magician, Zarathustra laments. He screams out, with all the eternal torture and smitten by you, you cruelest huntsman, you unfamiliar god, you unknown god. Now, of course, Wodan, the god of the hunt, the hunting god, and an unfamiliar god, an unknown god, is a hidden god. And this is something Zarathustra seems to be wrestling with, perhaps even Nietzsche, that God dies, the Christian God is left out of his mind, but he is interacting with some other force that's mysterious and opaque to him in his imagination. He's trying to cling to it and make it out. He's one of the first, perhaps, to really come in contact with this Wodanic force appearing in his mind. And so he's sort of saying to himself, I'm wrestling with this unknown God. This unknown God is coming to me, channeling to me. And he thinks it's Dionysus. He projects Dionysus onto it. But Jung's saying, no. You were having something much closer to home, Frederick. Much closer to home. In 1863, Nietzsche wrote a poem called To the Unknown God, where he says, I shall and will know thee, unknown one, who searches out the depths of my soul and blows through my life like a storm, ungraspable and yet my kinsman. I shall and will know thee and serve thee. Now that's pretty heavy metal. Of course, Wodan is a storm god. My kinsman makes sense because, of course, Nietzsche is a German, and he's describing his intention to serve this unknown force in the depth of his soul. And of course, if any of you remember one of Zarathustra's first speeches, a metaphor he is constantly using is this notion that there is a storm of suffering and pain and blackness floating over man. And Zarathustra says that out of this Wodanic storm there are droplets forming, who will come down and land on the cheeks of mankind. And these droplets will be the heralds of the lightning, of a lightning that is to come. And Zarathustra says that he is the first herald of the lightning falling out of the dark cloud that lowers over man. But the lightning will be the Superman. Now, I mentioned a previous part of Zarathustra earlier. I'm going to read you the entire lament because it adds an awful lot more context with all that we just discussed. This is called Ariane's Lament, and it goes, stretched out and shuddering, like a half-dead thing whose feet are warmed, shaken by unknown fevers, shivering with piercing icy frost arrows, hunted by you, O thought, unutterable, veiled, horrible one. You huntsman behind the clouds, struck down by your lightning bolt, your mocking eye that stares at me from the dark, so I lie, writhing, twisting, tormented, with all eternal tortures, smitten by you, cruel huntsman, you unknown god. You see inside of this the lightning metaphor. You see this suggestion that this unknown god has a mocking eye, and of course Wodan was famous for only having one eye. The huntsman behind the cloud, of course, this is a huntsman. He is veiled like a wizard is. And Nietzsche is experiencing this god as a figure that is hunted, a victim of this stalking, possessive god. Now, Jung is saying all this with the context that you do not want to give your spirit over to some sort of fifth-dimensional entity that lives inside of your collective imagination, whose will is to create a war to end all wars, to discover the heroes that he can harvest and take into the afterlife. You should be careful when that happens. And of course, he would look to Nietzsche and suggest that Nietzsche going insane in 1889 is exactly what was to be expected when somebody does this. Now, some people might say that Nietzsche died of syphilis, but this is also as short-sighted as saying Hitler had autism. You see, Wodan was done with Nietzsche's body in 1889 when he sent him insane. And there's a couple of very uncomfortable problems with this date, because Nietzsche went insane on the 3rd of January 1889, and Adolf Hitler was born in April 1889. Meaning that Adolf Hitler was inside his mother's womb as Nietzsche was going insane. Now, what makes this even more unsettling is that Hitler would have been 24 weeks old at this point when his synapses were forming inside of his brain to give him consciousness, just as Nietzsche's soul was alleviating itself of the spirit of Wodan. And to put the cherry on top, a famous painting came out in 1889 by a man called Franz Stuck. It depicts Wodan leading an army of the dead on horseback during a wild chase. Now look closely and tell me who Wodan has a resemblance to.